The Hyperloop intends to propel passengers through a low-pressure vacuum tube at speeds up to 700 miles per hour.
Aha! I found it. There it is. That's the Hyperloop. Okay, that's it. So I'm going to cruise the entire length of the Hyperloop, as I am curious about. There it is, the Hyperloop. Oh my word, there's someone on it. So, it's not tall enough to stand up in. Had quite an interesting chat with one of the guys who works on it. Pressure gauge. And so there's lots of these sort of accessy type ports. I don't know what they're for. What the hell's this one? Well, that's one way of leveling it. Are they still out? That's bizarre. So that one's mounted up. This one's missing completely. They're missing completely on every second one. And the whole thing is just bedded down on rubber. That might not even be rubber. It might be plywood or something. I think, as you see, it's starting to, the whole tube is rusted on the inside. I don't think they quite realise when they put the concrete in there was nowhere for the water to get out. So the whole thing is completely rusted up on the inside. Yep, that was me at the Hyperloop, and I seem to have had a somewhat different response to the Hyperloop than other reporters who covered it.
Imagine going from New York to Washington, D.C. or L.A. to San Francisco in less than an hour in one of these giant vacuum tubes.
Oh man, this is a heavy door. Okay, so what if I told you that there was a mode of transportation that not only promised to leave planes, trains, and automobiles all in the dust.
Oh, here we are at the Hyperloop. This is where they had the great competition for the future of transport. And time has not been quite so good to this place.
But to do so with extraordinary efficiency, hundreds of sensors, and it can frickin' hover.
Now, later, someone filled this guy in on just one or two of the shortcomings of the Hyperloop. And after that, he seems to have changed his tune somewhat.
It seems like the people crying debunked are assuming that all of the scientists and engineers at SpaceX and all these universities haven't taken a grade 11 physics course.
Really, all those highly skilled engineers, there's just no way that they could make a trivial mistake that, say, for instance, kindergarten scientists would know about.
Rust is a chemical compound formed due to the reaction of iron with water and oxygen.
I mean, let me just let you in on a little secret. When I first arrived at the Hyperloop, the tube was open and one of Elon Musk's engineers was working on the pusher, which is just a stripped-down Tesla. And I decided not to film him, basically because he was just some engineer doing his day job. And filming him and showing it to the hundreds of thousands of people, I thought would just be a kind of invasive dick move. You know, this was his day job. And at the time, I was just primarily interested in seeing what the hell he was doing and getting a technical assessment of the Hyperloop. Now, the very first thing I noticed about the Hyperloop within seconds was that it was completely rusted up on the inside. Completely. And yeah, that's a real problem, as I'll explain in a second. Now, the pusher engineer just paid this no mind whatsoever. He just never really thought about it. Yes, all of Elon Musk's genius engineers built a $10 million tube.
And not blowing up SpaceX's $12.5 million tubes.
I didn't realize that mild steel gets rusty when wet in our atmosphere.
So the excitement of Hyperloop comes down to Elon Musk.
He's the idol of all engineers. I mean, like the ultimate nerd, geek, like what have you. He's Nikola Tesla of our day and age.
So that one's mounted up. This one's missing completely.
It still sounds pretty complicated, Elon.
It's like a tube with an air hockey table. I swear it's not that hard.
Do you know rust is a chemical compound formed?
It seems like the people crying debunked are assuming that all of the scientists and engineers at SpaceX and all these universities haven't taken a grade 11 physics course.
Due to the reaction of iron.
Like they're not aware that sudden decompression due to like a bullet hole in the Hyperloop tube would be bad.
Well, that's one way of leveling it. I mean, Jesus, dude, how do you get into a tube, actually physically get into it, where you can't put your hands anywhere without them getting covered in rust and not notice it? I mean, when I first got into the tube, my first response is, Jesus, what happened to this? Now, for me, it took me fully seconds to work out what had happened with the inside of the tube here. To rust steel like this, you need a water source. And the only way you can get water all the way down the tube like that is from the concrete. Basically, for concrete to set, you need water. Well, you might say, well, can they have just blown air through the tube? Well, no, not really. Because if you dry the concrete out, it doesn't set properly. It's got to be wet whilst it's setting. And yet, there's a gazillion fairly simple ways they could have stopped the tube from getting rusty. It's just they didn't have the technical foresight to do it.
He's the idol of all engineers. I mean, like the ultimate nerd, geek, like what have you. He's Nikola Tesla of our day and age.
No, the idea that this is some great engineering team who thought this through in great detail is simply bollocks. They screwed up even the softball stuff of merely building a 1 kilometer long, $10 million tube.
I know that there are various companies that are trying to create the Hyperloop, and honestly, I think it's a lot easier than people think. It's like a tube with an air hockey table. I swear it's not that hard.
And Elon's right here. At the moment, it's just a tube. So this is the other end of the Hyperloop. And... So I only bolted half of it up, which is probably quite sensible. So it is actually just the whole thing is just a tube with an opening on either end. Not even remotely close to dealing with the engineering problems of trying to build a 600 kilometer or mile long real Hyperloop through difficult terrain in an earthquake zone.
Musk was elated with the results.
What this is really all about is advancing the state of transportation, trying new things that have never been done before.
This linear electric motor powers the model of the first British hopper train. The oval mountings are the hopper pads, and when in action, the hopper train runs virtually frictionless on a pad of air.
Passengers sit in a pressurized capsule that rides on a cushion of air.
Hundreds of sensors, and it can frickin' hover.
Shows how combining that magnetic levitation and a linear motor for propulsion could make a working train. And by the late 70s, British Rail adapted the techniques for a full-size version. Successful high-speed runs this summer convinced American backers to promote this German system into the marketplace. They're looking for $500 million from investors to build a track 260 miles long from Las Vegas to Disneyland at Anaheim.
So you'll be able to travel from San Francisco to Los Angeles in about 30 minutes.
What we really intended to do with the Hyperloop was really to spur interest in new forms of transportation.
Because aeroplanes are now frequently delayed on short routes, they believe this new train could at last compete with air travel.
It's also a lot faster. You can basically get from downtown LA to downtown San Francisco in 30 minutes.
If all goes well, the world's first floating high-speed passenger service might just be completed before the end of this century.
It sounds fantastical, but it's closer than you think, and these students are at the forefront of that movement.
I think, what this is really all about is advancing the state of transportation, trying new things that have never been done before.
Oh, no, not the pig! Not the pig! Not the pig!
So why would rust be a problem in a vacuum tube? Well, firstly, if you want to pump something down to a respectable vacuum quickly...
So Hyperloop is the idea of a high-speed train inside of a tube held at very low pressure near a vacuum environment like space.
You need clean, polished surfaces, and powdery surfaces like this will just absorb all sorts of volatile stuff, which will slow down the pumping process.
Now, last year it took 30 to 45 minutes for SpaceX to vacuum seal the tube. This year, 10 to 15. Progress.
Plus, it's probably the reason for their dust problems. Not that this greatly matters, of course, as essentially all of their competition entries, none of them have gone even remotely fast enough for this to be a problem. Hell, the third place in their speed trials was about 30 miles per hour. I drove faster than that down the side of the Hyperloop. Okay, so here we go for a drive down the Hyperloop with apparently intermittent stops. Hey, 30 miles an hour, it's almost as fast as things go in the Hyperloop. As for the engineer I met, now he worked on the pusher and hadn't really given any thought to the viability of the project as a whole, not even the simplest issues that this would entail. He hadn't seen any of my videos on the subject and had no idea who I was. Which is a shame really, because otherwise he might have been better prepared for what happened next. Which is I got the thermal camera out and pointed it down the tube. Now the metal oxide, the rust, is great for thermal cameras in that it gives you a very accurate temperature. And so you point the thermal camera down the tube and it was instantly obvious that the top of the tube, which of course is in the sun, was about 10 degrees hotter than the bottom of the tube. In fact, it was so instantly obvious that you'd be able to feel it. And sure enough, you could just touch the top of the tube and it was warm to the touch. And you could touch the bottom of the tube and it was cool to the touch. The significance of this was just completely lost on the engineer, who he just shrugged. So the roof is warmer than the floor, so what?
It seems like the people crying debunked are assuming that all of the scientists and engineers at SpaceX and all these universities haven't taken a grade 11 physics course.
Like I say, he was a nice guy, technically competent what he was doing on the pusher. Nonetheless, I had to explain to him that if the tube is hotter on the top than on the bottom, then the top will expand while the bottom will not. So, ballpark numbers, if you've got about a meter of steel, it's about 3 feet. Every degree you heat it up, it increases by about 10 parts per million in length. So if we've got a kilometre long tube, 1,000 metres, that's about 1 centimetre per degree Celsius. And of course we're heating it up just by a mere 10 degrees here. So that means that the top's going to be about 10 centimetres, about 4 inches longer than the bottom. Now Elon Musk wants to build a 1,000-kilometre long Hyperloop, which means the top of the tube is going to be about 100 metres. That's about a football pitch longer than the bottom of the tube. And that's just the heat variation from a mere slight 10-degree difference on one side of the tube to the other. And yeah, there's no way you can mount a tube up like this with that sort of level of expansion without getting massive heat buckling. And this is just the temperature variation on a nothing special morning. Now I later filmed on the outside of the tube with a thermal camera. Sadly, the paint on the outside of the tube is kind of reflective, which kind of screws up the temperature profiles for the thermal camera. Nonetheless, you can see the heat load problems, that the top is going to get hot and the shadow on the bottom is actually going to get cool. And it's likely to cycle through temperatures like this on a daily basis. In fact, I kick myself now that I didn't just sort of hang a piece of string off the top of the tube to see if you could detect the heat buckling. But whatever. I'm sure Musk's engineers would never have spent $12 million on a tube construction that they would never be able to make for the Los Angeles to San Francisco Hyperloop. Now this is interesting. So it's a continuous weld all the way around, yeah? So that's how they basically make the big tubes, is you go a steel plate and you weld it up, and then this is how they've actually joined the two segments, yeah? One is widened somewhat, and one is not. And I know whether they got an O-ring in there or what. I doubt it. I mean, fitting two tubes together like this is a complete son of a bitch. It really is. As you can imagine, we're at 19, so that's between 18 and 19, that one. And here's another one. So do they have them like really frequently? And yeah, they do. They're like only 10 or so long meter sections. So they've got a seal of some sort every 10 or so meters, which the wildlife is loving. The joins on the tube were welds, which are good for holding vacuum, but a nightmare for maintenance and expansion issues. I mean, hell, think about it. This is merely a 1 kilometer long tube where you have about 100 full tube welds on it. And with all of those, you would have to check them for corrosion and structural integrity.
You know, even if I'm sort of wrong about the economic assumptions behind the Hyperloop, it would still be a really fun ride. Even if only one of it ever existed, it would.
A viewing port. And this is about right. That's about what you would need. Yeah, that's about right. It's an inch thick. For a real window, that's about what you need. As you can see, it's starting to accumulate stuff.
I really think this is an amazing opportunity for young engineers, inventors, and designers to really get their minds working on something that could change history. It's encouraging to see.
So with the viewing port, they're apparently glued it on. There is no apparent seal on this whatsoever. So this is probably glued on. Which point I'm quite sure why you need... Oh no, there is an O-ring. There's an O-ring in here. There we go. As you can see, it looks like they painted over the O-ring at some point. Not the smartest of things to have done.
Elon has stated that he realizes these challenges, but has strong faith in the skills and innovation of those working on the problem.
And just for anyone who misses the understatement here, no one who works with vacuums seriously would paint over an O-ring, because the O-ring is the seal.
Pods could be launched down the tube at near hypersonic speeds, then boosted by linear induction motors, essentially making the tube a big railgun.
Look, bottom line, things like solar roadways and the Hyperloop are great ideas in principle. But the engineering, just to make something like this even remotely practical, is monstrous. And that's before you venture into the real issues of can you make it commercially viable. And having looked at the Hyperloop test track, it addresses none of the real technical issues of building a hundreds of kilometer long Hyperloop, let alone through difficult earthquake-prone terrain, let alone making it commercially viable or safely running people through it. Hell, no one's even built a capsule that can take a human through this vacuum chamber yet. But honestly, I'd love to see Elon put his money where his mouth is and just build a capsule that he's got enough faith in to carry him down this Hyperloop.
Well, I shook Elon Musk's hand. He sat in our pod. It's the best day of my life. Go Hyperloop!
And I should stress that if you were to get in that capsule and get in the vacuum tube, you would die almost immediately because it's not airtight. I mean, that's the level that we're at here. The people are actually impressed that there's a seat that can carry a human in the pod. So at about $10 million, all he's basically done is build a very large and very cheaply made vacuum chamber, which is almost entirely redundant for purpose, as none of the competition entries have really yet gained any significant speed benefit from running in a vacuum. That is, they might just as well have built a 1 kilometer long monorail track. You know, like the ones they were building half a century ago or so.
The train weighed about 22 tons. It managed to get to 107 miles an hour in a 1 mile stretch from start to finish, which pretty well proved that the science was there, ready to expand.
Sorry, Mom, the mob has spoken.
Put simply, this is about as useful in demonstrating the viability of the Hyperloop as this was in demonstrating the viability of solar roadways. Now, some of you might say, but wait, in the speed competition, didn't people get up to 200 miles an hour in the test track? Yes, they did. And if you think that's significant, you really weren't paying attention to the significant details. But this video was really about my hands-on assessment of Elon Musk's Hyperloop. And I figure I'll cover the speed competition, the results of which are almost as funny as this one, in the next video. Many thanks to all those who supported this video through Patreon. If you want to support this lone voice in the wilderness speaking out against this infuriating hype, the links are below.
If there was an Olympics for engineering, this would be it. We're just outside Los Angeles, California at the Hyperloop pod competition.
It seems like the people crying debunked are assuming that all of the scientists and engineers at SpaceX and all these universities haven't taken a grade 11 physics course.